So it's my great pleasure to welcome Tanya Harrod here with us tonight. I think you are, without a doubt, one of the first and foremost experts on the field of ceramics, particularly in Britain, but also beyond. And I think it will be a really nice opportunity to both have an in-depth look at Gordon Baldwin's practice, but of course also remember him, as some of you might know, or be able to see Gordon Baldwin passed away shortly before the opening of his exhibition here at the Kunstverein. Tanya Harrod is the author of the prize-winning The Crafts in Britain in the 20th Century. With Glenn Adamson and Edward S. Cook, she's the co-founder and editor of the Journal of Modern Craft. Her book, The Last Sane Man, Michael Cardew, Modern Pots, Colonialism, and the Counterculture, won the 2012 James Tate Black Prize for Biography. Her latest books include The Real Thing, Essays on Making in the Modern World, Craft and Humankind, Ruskin Spear, Class, Culture, and Art in the 20th Century Britain. She's written for the Burlington Magazine, Frieze, The Guardian, Crafts, The Literary Review, and the Times Literary Supplement. She serves on the advisory panel of the Burlington Magazine, was advisor to the Craft Lives project based at the National Sound Archive of the British Library, and is a member of the Contemporary Art Society's Crafts Acquisition Committee. She's a member of the International Association of Art Critics and was a senior research fellow at the Paul Mellon Center in 2021. She's currently working on a double life of Margaret and Rolf Gardiner. Tonight was made possible by Grundig and the Hapag-Lloyd Stiftung. Our thanks also go out to Corby Mora, London. And without much further ado, thank you, Tanya, for being here with us.
This is my attempt to compensate. Es ist so schön, hier zu sein und über diese wunderbare Ausstellung und über Gordon Baldwin zu sprechen. Es tut mir leid, dass mein Vortrag auf Englisch sein wird. Ich hatte ihn gerne auf Deutsch gehalten. Aber am Ende dachte ich, dass meine Übersetzung für dieses Publikum nicht gut genug sein würde. Und ich dachte auch nicht, dass Google Translate es besser machen würde. Leider, ich werde nie erfahren, ob dieses eine verpasste Gelegenheit ist. I thought I should try and translate it, and then my nerve failed me. I'm going to open this talk about the late Gordon Baldwin, who in fact died. Can you hear me? Should I get closer? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm going to open this talk about Gordon Baldwin, who died on May the 18th, very recently, with a small tribute. I want to play a piece of music, just sort of in his memory. Wait a minute. Sorry. I wanted to... That was the Japanese master Kohachiro Miyata playing the Japanese flute, or shakuhachi, one of the most important wind instruments of Japan. It's been played for over a millennium. And it's an extraordinarily simple instrument in that there are only 5 holes, no keys, but it has a large chromatic scale. And many of the solo pieces are aids for meditation. And this is an ancient melody, Honshirabe, which was an absolute favorite of Gordon Baldwin's, who loved its wandering sound. And music played a very important part in Gordon's life. He admired a great range of world music, as well as many individual composers, Benjamin Britten, the Americans John Cage and George Crumb, Stockhausen, John Adams, Philip Cashian. So I hoped we could imagine Gordon listening to this piece of music, sitting in his studio. And I want to say something a bit personal about the first time I met Gordon in 1988. I went to visit him in his studio. As you see, this photograph was taken after that occasion to go with what I wrote about him. And his studio was just full of all this inspiring work, but in the very unlikely setting of a boys' private school. And the day I spent with him was an extraordinary introduction to someone who combined committed teaching with making art in a material that was not then recognized as part of the progressive art world. He mostly hand-built using coils of clay, occasionally using molds. He fired each piece multiple times. And he found freedom, and with this freedom, he evolved his own sculptural, painterly and graphic language. But because he used fired, glazed, or rather slipped diengoba clay, his work was, until recently, not part of any fine art discourse. As he pointed out in 1980, "I'm not at all concerned with labels. I work with clay. Therefore, I am craft categorized. Too bad. I work with the preoccupations of an artist." So much of my first meeting with Gordon Baldwin was very vivid, beginning with the schoolboy on the stairwell, asking Gordon if he would help him make a vase for his mother. Gordon saw this not as a chore, but as an exciting opportunity. He reflected that it might open up a whole field of experience. A boy might go on, might make more ambitiously. And some of the boys he taught did indeed go on, opening up new fields of experience. The sculptor Richard Wentworth, the choreographer Richard Alston are just 2 of the schoolboys that Gordon Baldwin released for art. As we talked on that day, a strain of melancholy came through. Baldwin quoted the poet Robert Graves, "You've got to keep the god awfulness of everything at bay." He also said, "I feel I'm making a hollow vessel out of parts of a landscape or inscape." We'll come back to the inscape. And he said that when he was a student, he learnt he could just wander a line along. And strangest of all, he said, "It's actually the sky I'm dealing with. I'm making lumps of sky all the time." Music came in, especially the Japanese flute. Gordon said he liked art in which nothing much happens, nor did he hurry to see the work of other contemporary artists. Early modernism in all its forms was enough for him. He said, "I don't have the inclination to see what's going on. I suppose arrogantly, I think that everyone has to keep up with me." 5 years later, he did notice the work of the Anglo-Indian sculptor Anish Kapoor, and made a pair of deeply pigmented blue pots in his honor. But to return to the music, which seems so important on that memorable day, on some occasions an individual piece of music influenced Gordon's work, as with one of a series of vessels that comment on sound. This piece, it's a not terribly good archive photograph, the piece was made in 1983, took inspiration from George Crumb's 1970 piece of music, Ancient Voices of Children, which were settings of poems by Federico Garcia Lorca. And it's famous for its strange, eerie vocal effects. The composer, George Crumb, wanted to restore to himself, using Lorca's words, the ancient soul of a child. So this piece, Vessel in the Form of a Primitive Voice, is a direct response to Crumb's music. It sits on its own ceramic plinth or socle, a practice that Gordon took up at that time, the idea that the plinth can be as important as the sculpture itself, was derived from Baldwin's deep appreciation of Constantine Brancusi. This archive picture leads me to go on to a similar piece. It's almost like the same piece, but on a slightly different plinth, which is now in York Art Gallery. And these sound-related vessels are a recurring theme in Gordon Baldwin's work. Here is Vessel in the Form of an Ancient Sound of 2007. This emphasis on sound is, I think, of great interest. For Gordon Baldwin, this did not imply picking up a work and tapping it or striking it to hear the pure fine ring we associate in particular with porcelain, the pleasure of Chinese connoisseurs, indeed of connoisseurs all over the world. The scale of Gordon's work means it takes his work away from that kind of intimacy. I mean, one can pick up works by Gordon. It can be rewarding, but that kind of tactile sensuousness we often associate with ceramics, in particular with, for example, Japanese tea bowls, is not central to his work. Here's another piece reflecting on sound, Vessel in the Form of an Ancient Sound, 2 of the same year. I think we can see that for Gordon Baldwin, the mysterious interior of the piece and its dark opening suggests unknowable sound emanating. And we see this idea reiterated in the title of this 2010 piece, which is in the exhibition here, Vessel Called Boulder, Shouting. Aside from sound, openings into the volume of a sculpture could suggest air released or exhaled, as with this magnificent piece in York Art Gallery, entitled Vessel for Dark Air, a piece of 2003. In a world of categories, it may seem obvious today that Gordon Baldwin is a sculptor, but these openings are what make Baldwin's sculpture peculiarly ceramic. His are hand-built vessel-like objects that contain. They're not usable. They would probably leak if filled with water, but nonetheless they're vessels. Thus, understanding his work necessarily involves some appreciation of the special qualities of fired clay vessels, which up until recently was mostly terra incognita to the art world. Baldwin's work, despite its sculptural quality, requires that we think about this idea of potter's space, the interior space that's unique to ceramics. Containing has a spatial presence that we intuit even if we're not fully conscious of it. Even ceramic figurines have to be hollow, and the whole must be left somewhere to let out the expanded air when the piece is fired in the kiln, otherwise it would explode. In the case of these playful puppen or ceramic figurines of the 18th century, such holes are hidden. This 18th century figurine of Britannia, made in a South London factory, has therefore a sizable hole in its base. But for Gordon Baldwin, this potter's space is signalled by the opening, not hidden, as with the figurine of Britannia, but visible, sharply cut in various forms. It could be a circle or a cross or a slash, sometimes ragged, and there are beautiful examples of this downstairs. Invariably, we see that the glaze inside the piece is dark and shiny, as with this piece, Vessel for Dark Air. Talking about Vessel for Dark Air, Gordon agreed that it had something somber and challenging about it, reflecting that all my work over the past few years has been wrested out of darkness. And indeed, the curator at York City Art Gallery found this piece challenging, sort of frightening, the sort of darkness concealed within. The opening in these pieces suggests a secret contained within, sound, air, whole worlds unseen. Baldwin was very fond of the word inscape, a neologism used by the British poet Gerard Manley Hopkins to suggest the uniqueness of a thing, its oneness, its specialness. Not fixed, but with a mysterious inner dynamic, as if it were encapsulating the forces of nature, growth, change, and decay. Indeed, the title of this exhibition, very appropriately, is Gordon Baldwin, Inscape. Gordon appears to have used the word in ways that echo Heidegger's use of the word das Ding in his 1950 essay of that name. In this essay, Heidegger refers to a ceramic vessel as a way of thinking about things and materiality and our place in the world. The materiality of a pot is not in the material, but in the void, a void filled with air. Not that I'm suggesting that Baldwin read Heidegger, but I think his use of the word inscape refers to the special nature of vessel space. Here, another piece from the show downstairs, small vessel from an inscape. And here, a remarkable piece from Los Angeles County Museum of 1984, which combines several of Baldwin's preoccupations with the integrated base or plinth, with graphic mark making, and with a ragged, dark opening into that special dark ceramic space. Movement, too, was something that Baldwin often embraced in his work. This is his rocking piece, which is of 1971, which is the earliest piece in the exhibition here. And there's a lot of manganese in this glaze, and the piece, when rocked, catches the light and becomes incandescent, changeable. Gordon rather liked to photograph his work out of doors, and that's where the light would strike pieces. Here's another rocking piece, this time matte blue and dark, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, with incised lines and painted freely in black. Its opening barely visible here at the top, but perhaps suggesting the antithesis of light. So in Baldwin's work, we have sound, sometimes movement, and an existential sensitivity to hidden spaces. I've always been struck by the titles that Gordon gave to his work. Sometimes they were overlooked by galleries, but they are essential guides to his thought, whether they're fairly obvious, as with this painting in the form of a bowl, a wonderful piece in this exhibition, which is part of an extended series with similar titles, that celebrate the union of the vessel form and painterly activity. Sometimes they're geographies, as in the series Vessel from the Place of Stones. This is another wonderful piece in this show with these strange slashes as openings at the top of the piece, which you can't really see in this image. This Place of Stones was actually a real place, a reference to a beach in North Wales, Porthnaigl, known in English as Hell's Mouth on the Llyn Peninsula in North Wales, where Gordon spent many summers. And one of the strange things about Gordon, which perhaps I'll mention more later, was the way in which he obeyed the laws of chance. He was taken to that part of North Wales because he opened an atlas. He wanted to be in Wales, but he stuck a pin randomly, and this took him to the place where he and his wife, Nancy, spent summer after summer. And it was rather odd when you meet someone like Gordon, who seems in many ways a very grave and rational figure, that for him actually playing with chance was one of the ways in which he was able to live his life. Sometimes Gordon offers a classical reference, as in this, it's part of a whole series, the Sisyphus series. His titles, I think, are always worth pondering, and this, of course, refers to the famous myth of the King of Corinth, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. Here we have these blocky extrusions that suggest the impossibility of Sisyphus's task, the impossibility of dealing with this boulder's movement. Gordon had also read Albert Camus' 1942 essay, Le Mythe de Sisyphe, in which Camus reflects on the absurdity of modern life, and this too may have flowed into this piece. I guess I've said enough to suggest that Gordon was a supremely serious artist, who, though originally wanting to be a painter, found his language as a sculptor in the manipulation of clay, also using it as a surface for painting, drawing, and sgraffito. He also expressed himself through drawing on paper. Some of these drawings were to do with pieces he was working on, but latterly it became a separate pursuit, which until very recently has been given rather little recognition. But who couldn't respond to something like this? 4 lines drawn slowly in May 2018. This was a response to his encroaching blindness, something that began to be an anxiety for Baldwin in 2013. And out of it came some haunting work on paper with echoes of Cy Twombly, but strongly revelatory of Gordon's own struggle. Here, Darkening, April 2017. As he said in an interview in 2013, his work could take him to some very bleak places where I'm entirely alone. I'd like now to look at Gordon's work chronologically while not attempting a survey of his huge output. He was very much influenced early by figures who taught him at the Central School of Arts and Crafts when he was there as a student during 1951 to 54. He stayed on there first as a technician and then as a tutor. In particular, the sculptors William Turnbull, who you see in this image here, and Edoardo Paolozzi. These 2 young men were often in the ceramics department at the Central School because of the special nature of the Central School of Arts and Crafts, which came out of the arts and crafts movement. The first principal was W.R. Letherby. So there's a strong feeling of a kind of unity of the arts. And indeed, the early Central School may have, up to a point, contributed to the ideals of the Bauhaus. It was essentially a design school, but where fine artists taught. And partly because of the presence of artists like Paolozzi and Turnbull and Richard Hamilton, ceramics, as practiced at the Central School of Arts and Crafts in the 50s, became a hive of radical activity. Gordon was deeply inspired by Turnbull and Paolozzi, and he'd watch Paolozzi taking a lump of clay and poking his fingers, his great podgy fingers in it, shouting for some black stuff to make marks, not worrying two pennies about ceramic quality and feeling for clay. It was an approach entirely different to the kind of standards that had ruled the studio ceramic world between the world wars, and whose neo-Orientalism had been set out beautifully and clearly by Bernard Leach in his A Potter's Book of 1940. From Turnbull and Paolozzi, Gordon also came to think about surface, abraded, ancient-seeming. He probably saw work like this, which would have been a plaster. It was cast later, Paolozzi's Crocodile, although he didn't incorporate bits of abandoned technology like Paolozzi did. At the same time, though, Gordon was in a ceramics department, and he had to make cups and saucers like these, which were in his degree show. You can see they're rather influenced by the paintings of Victor Passmore, whose abstraction occurred just at the moment. He was also teaching at the Central. Gordon even designed and made ceramic electric heaters while a student, and he demonstrated throwing on television. And when short of money, he would make saleable tableware. Because of this special environment, the Central School of Arts and Crafts produced other remarkable ceramicists who are also best seen as sculptors in clay. I want to say a little bit about Ruth Duckworth, partly because she was born in Hamburg, and she left Hamburg in 1936 and came to England, and she was taught by Gordon, and then they taught alongside each other. But just to sort of suggest the radicalism of clay at that time, from about 1946 to 55, she worked as a stone carver. So as a young woman of 30, she was carving like this in Hopton wood stone. And the influences are obvious, and it's not a really very exciting piece of work. She only found her true métier in the mid-50s when she discovered clay and became a highly innovative hand builder. This is her weed pot of 1966, pointedly made not to hold water, created soon after she stopped teaching at the Central. And here's a view of a shelf in her studio at Kew in 1962, showing the range of her work, which included totemic pots alongside archaic-looking figurines, and on the left and right foreground, a flower vase and a teapot. Like Gordon, she designed and made functional ware to keep afloat financially. Ruth Duckworth left for a fellowship in the United States in 1964, finally settling there because she was frustrated by the lack of opportunities to make large-scale work in Britain. And here we see the kind of opportunities that resulted from her move to Chicago, this extraordinary, it's a sort of wall, it's a mural, a small room completely lined with relief clay work by Duckworth in the science area of Chicago University. Another radical ceramicist, Gillian Lowndes, I think also suggests the excitement of the Central School in the 50s and 60s. From 56 to 58, she was a student of Gordon's, having decided to concentrate on ceramics rather than sculpture because, as she put it, there were more possibilities. She attended transformative classes in basic design at the Central School. The Bauhaus Vorkurs, recast for post-war Britain and pioneered at the Central School. And this is her drum form of 1967, and here, made in the 70s, an experiment with fiberglass and metal pins dipped in slip. She ultimately became an adventurous collagist and bricolagist, all materials submitted to the firing process. Now, this is a piece from the Anthony Shaw collection at York. Gillian Lowndes, like Gordon Baldwin, was to have a whole career in which she made work that looked like sculpture without being part of the sculpture world. 6 years after her death, she was, as it were, discovered by the art world, and now her estate is managed by a prestigious fine art gallery, the Sunday Painter. But to return to Gordon, by 1960, Gordon had been teaching at the Central School for 4 years and created this remarkable totemic piece, Standing Form, now in Paisley Museum and Art Gallery. And he told me it was a response to the testing of atomic bombs, which had been continuously carried out since 1945. Another work of 1962, The Watcher, echoes the totemic neo-primitivism of sculpture by Turnbull and by Lynn Chadwick. Since 1957, Gordon had also been teaching at Eton College, which gave him ample studio space and granted him a measure of stability and a chance to create his own unique language of form and surface. I think one's got to sort of think of the kind of isolation in which he worked. There were just these few rather extraordinary figures coming out of the Central School. And then there was Gordon. The rocking piece, that's the earliest piece in the show downstairs, is the beginning of a period of working with very dark glazes. This is Slow Move of 1966. And here, the rather extraordinary Black Rise of 1966. And you can see the way in which this glossy black glaze conferred a kind of invisibility on the sculpture. And his rather curious use of lettering, the title is incorporated into the piece. This strange effect produced by these dark glazes was further explored in a strange, surreal piece. I'm sorry I haven't got a better photograph of it, Black Vessel with Shadow, in which he creates the standing part of the piece, puts it in bright sunlight, and then draws the shadow and creates the shadow in ceramic. This was linked to, I would love to have been there, a teaching fortnight at Eton College, where Gordon and his schoolboy pupils all had to decide they were surrealists. They had to be surrealists for a fortnight, live and breathe surrealism. And Gordon actually recreated certain iconic pieces like Man Ray's Gift, and Bügel Leisen mit Stiften, an iron with nails coming out of it. Gordon recreated a whole group of these iconic surrealist objects. And out of this investigation of surrealism came his poem boxes, which played games with chance. As you can see, the one on the left, 5 seconds in the rain. The rain fell where drops settled, he made holes in the piece. And on the right, second pink poem box, quite elaborate procedures were followed. A book was selected from a shelf by chance, a page was found by chance, a line by chance. And it seems to have been a book about Chinese classical painting, because the text on the surface of the box reads, Fan Quan walked through the snow-clad mountains for months before he put a single stroke on silk, a reference to the Sung dynasty, Chinese landscape painter famous for secluding himself among mountains. Gordon's love for the high days of early modernism was central to another series he called Reach for the Eye, a pun on the more usual phrase, reach for the sky. And out of it came a series of objects inspired in part by Umberto Boccioni's 1912 sculpture, Development of a Bottle in Space. This was Boccioni's contribution to what he described as the mummified art of sculpture. It was made in plaster and posthumously cast in bronze. Gordon's contribution was rather different. He recalled of this series, and this is very typical of Gordon, he didn't know what he was going to do when he went into the studio. He extruded some pipes, and he remembered folding the clay for the lower section of the bottle, but he didn't go into the studio with any object in mind. And then he found himself with this strange bottle which marvelously opened up new space for him. Gordon's variant on the bottle in space created new combinations of object, sculpture, and painterly and graphic surface. And this is an archive image of a group of these developed bottles shown at Bury St Edmunds Art Gallery in 1981. Again, one of many shows that was pretty much overlooked. This is his windswept bottle from the same series, now in York City Art Gallery. Another series also drew on iconic early modern work, Man Ray's Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, a sewing machine wrapped in a blanket. Man Ray's tribute to Count Lautréamont, which was Isidore Ducasse was his pseudonym. Lautréamont's observation, as beautiful as the accidental encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. And here we see in Gordon's studio a photograph of Man Ray's Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, framed and hung. And here is one of a whole series of enigma pieces. The mysterious shape is caught or tied up with this web of sgraffito lines, while the rest of the textured form is painted over in black. By contrast, the classical world and early modernism actually go hand in hand, but it floats up in Baldwin's Belvedere series of the late 80s, inspired by art school memories of a cast of the Belvedere torso. And what Baldwin offers in this piece is, in effect, the antithesis of the kind of drawing he was made to do before he went to the Central School at Lincoln School of Art, which was a very good, small, provincial art school, but he was expected to make highly worked drawings from casts before proceeding on to life drawing. But what he offers, in fact, is the antithesis of that. Its title, or sort of subtitle, Just Wander a Line Along, takes us into another world, that of Paul Klee's thoughts on spontaneous drawing set out in his Pädagogische Skizzenbuch, published by the Bauhaus in 1925 and translated just in time for Gordon in 1953. And it was a book much read by Gordon. He liked to sort of quote, an active line on a walk, moving freely without a goal, a walk for a walk's sake. And the idea of a wandering, intuited line, rather like the wandering sound of a Japanese flute, appealed to him, delighted him. So on this piece, this Belvedere piece, the wandering lines and the painted passages make no attempt to decorate the piece. In fact, they're rather at odds with it. They just have a life of their own. In his studio, Gordon pinned a poem by Jean Arp to the wall. He who tried to bring down a cloud by shooting it with an arrow will use his arrows in vain. Many sculptors resemble such strange hunters. What one should do is this: one should charm a cloud by fiddling on a drum or drumming on a fiddle. Before long, the cloud will descend, frolic on the ground, and filled with self-confidence, turn into stone. That's how, with the wave of his hand, the sculptor creates the most beautiful sculpture. This cloud poem seems to me to speak to so much of Gordon's work, and certainly Arp was one of his most beloved artists. Gordon admired his writings and his interest in using chance as a creative tool, both for collages but also for sculpture, as with this 1949 bronze Fruit de Pagode in Tate Modern, purchased in 1951. That Arp was an influence both as an artist and a writer is not in doubt. Here, Baldwin's Dark Vessel in December in the show here at Kunstverein. Pieces like these, indeed many of Baldwin's sculptures, were generated by intuitive working or by the laws of chance, a distancing procedure that echoed the titles of Arp's own sculptures made in a similar spirit: Stone Formed by a Human Hand, or Sculpture to be Lost in a Forest. I want finally to turn to a very particular declaration by Gordon of his interest in a characteristic trope of modern art, and this is in his use of grids. The grid, as a thing in itself, not as a design tool, had roots in the Bauhaus Vorkurs and was of interest to figures like Paolozzi when Baldwin was a student at the Central School. Here's Paolozzi's design exercise of 1950. In her famous 1978 essay on grids, Rosalind Krauss saw the use of grids in 20th century art as a declaration of the autonomous nature of modern art, a turning away from nature, and a refusal of earlier art. Nonetheless, it had scientific and spiritual underpinnings. But both Rosalind Krauss and John Elderfield, in his later article on grids, signal a resistance to the grid structure, finding its employment ubiquitous among 20th century artists. While praising Mondrian and Joseph Albers, Krauss and Elderfield finally dismiss grids as an all-too-easy route to a kind of modernism. This, I'd suggest, is far from the case with Baldwin's use of the grid. There's nothing easy about it, partly because his grids are integrated with three-dimensional surfaces in remarkable ways. Here are two views of Cloud 2 from an archive, for a couple of archive photographs showing the piece front and back. The piece suggests Arp's cloud poem, but it also chimes with Krauss's belief that behind every kind of grid lies a 19th century painterly fascination with views through windows. In fact, Baldwin took numerous photographs of the skylight in his studio, the glass reinforced with metal wire. And Gordon made the connection between his studio skylight and this very piece in conversation with a fellow teacher at Eton, Anthony Ray. The powerful black lines recall the wrapping effect of Baldwin's Enigma series, and clouds and sky are evoked by pouring cobalt carbonate from a jug over the white ground of the piece. Black Square with Grid of 1995 has a completely different mood. Once again, there is the sense of a mysterious dark interior. The grid appears integrated with this flattened, if essentially organic form. Only the fact that the clay body is revealed at the base disrupts our confidence in the all-over blackness of this sculpture, reminding us of its identity as ceramic. And here, flat form with grid, again quite different. The undulating, flowing surface of the piece is disciplined by the grid, while the grid is softened by the tenderness of the form. And finally, the curious, haunting crucible with black rectangles of 2010 here at Kunstverein, in which a stone sleeps on an extended plinth. As always with Gordon's pieces, there are these powerful early 20th century sculptural artistic echoes. Why is it called crucible, a refractory vessel for melting metal, a severe test, or perhaps the situation where different forces have to interact, in this case, a plinth and a sleeping stone? All these grid pieces suggest a tension between intuition and order. With clouds in mind, Baldwin also turned to their antithesis, the grid, with its modernist antecedents and a multiplicity of other associations with architectural plans and the disciplines of graphic design. I'm not sure that Gordon realized how extraordinary these pieces were, again, because he was living without a very obvious context. When I met him first, he told me that he felt that none of the really big artistic breakthroughs had ever taken place in ceramics. Well, we might dispute that, starting perhaps with 18th century small figurines, which are incredible in themselves. But he didn't feel depressed by this observation. What he was doing was combining painterly or graphic marks with sculptural forms in an endless, ongoing exploration. And his grid series, and indeed all his work, suggests how fruitful these investigations could be. I'm going back rather gloomily to his status before now, in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Strangely, to admire a major artist like Gordon Baldwin seemed very much like a private research project. So too did admiring the potters he taught, figures like Gillian Lowndes, figures like Ruth Duckworth, figures who admired him and matched his ambitiousness, like the late Ewan Henderson. I'm afraid I haven't got an image of his extraordinary work. For me, these ceramicists form a kind of School of London in clay, analogous to the so-called School of London identified by the artist R.B. Kitaj in the 1970s, including artists like Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff and their visceral investigations of impastoed oil paint. But now we're in a different world. Sadly, Gordon hasn't really lived to enjoy it. I mean, he's had a very happy last few years, and it's very sad he's gone. But great things have been achieved for the status of fired clay, made by men and women who only work with that material. And so, well, with regard to this magnificent show, we must thank Tommaso Corvimora and Milan Thayer here. And we have a new book, Gordon Baldwin Inscape, which is to go with the show, a revelation in the terms of its multiplicity of images, plenty of Gordon's drawings, and something I knew very little about. Here's another of these haunting drawings, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Almost unknown to me, Gordon's poetry, which is, lots of it is included in this book. But perhaps I should also say that Gordon's work was always appreciated in Europe, perhaps in a sort of deeper way, in the Netherlands and in Germany in particular. An important retrospective was organized by Doris Kuchen-Schneider at the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam in 1989. And among several works in German museums, there is a piece by Gordon right here in Hamburg at the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe, bought from Gallery Böwig in Hanover. Sadly, not currently on view. The only studio pottery I could find in the museum today was three very beautiful pieces by Madeleine Adundo. And this is rather a small image of a piece that seems part of his investigations, often titled Painting in the Form of a Bowl. Gordon had numerous well-received solo exhibitions in Germany, and as he himself observed, the Continentals have been kind to me. Thanks. The mic.
Mine is on.
Oh, yours is off. Would you like this one?
Fine, so we can pass it around in the audience as well. All right, I think it's on. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I think it's something that I'll revisit as soon as we have the files ready, and it will also be shared online if anyone else wants to have another listen. At this point, I think it would be really nice to open up for questions. I know there's a few members here in the audience that usually don't come that might have expertise in this field as well. So I would be very curious to hear if there are any thoughts or questions in the audience tonight. And I'm sure those questions could be asked in German as well. Also falls es Fragen gibt, Kommentare aus dem Publikum.
Yes,
I
Picasso.
saw a lot of Picasso's small.
Gordon was really excited when he first saw Picasso that an exhibition was put on in England in 1952 or 1 or 2 of the work that he'd done at Valerie. And there were, in fact, a whole group of English ceramicists who were dismissed very contemptuously by Bernard Leach as the Picassiettes, like the word serviette, but Picassiettes. For someone like Bernard Leach, steeped in a kind of neo-Oriental approach, Picasso's tin-glazed earthenware was not permissible. It was clownish, he thought. But there were some wonderful things made by figures like William Newland. Again, this was an earlier group at the Central School who were inspired by Picasso. And this rather accessible, playful work was bought by education authorities. So these pieces were seen in schools all over the country. And I mean, they are a sort of a reaction against the war. They're a sort of playful feel of the Mediterranean in gloomy, rainy England. And Gordon, he didn't sort of linger with that work, but he was interested in it as a very young man. But I was saying to Milan that that such was a sort of rigid structure of the art world, I think, in the sort of 70s maybe, most of all, that even a great figure like Picasso's forays into clay were regarded as heretical, wrong, you know, a terrible waste of talent. So there was so little understanding between these worlds at that point. But I mean, we seem to be in quite a different place now. You know, so many artists are turning to clay or interested in ceramic.
I would be curious, yes, because you said that Gordon might not have fully experienced the current moment or the coming moment. Also, I think there's a real sense of a future that's bright for ceramics in your lecture today, and I think in your outlook also. Could you maybe address that and speak a little bit to artists who are now emerging, who you might find interesting in the way they're working, or maybe also what ceramics mean in an age where things are increasingly dematerialized and in the cloud, not Gordon Baldwin's cloud, but maybe the digital cloud.
Yes, well, I mean, there's so many interesting young artists working with clay, and actually taking it seriously. I mean, not. Well, I'm thinking of someone like Aaron Angel we spoke about earlier. There was a strange evening at the ICA when Aaron Angel was talking excitedly about glazes, whereas the more sort of radical potters of the 90s, 80s, 90s had kind of trained themselves not to talk about that kind of thing because it was not, it seemed, they wanted to get away from the way in which when people see something ceramic, they often say, well, how's it made? I mean, I often say that myself. I'm really interested. But, and what's it for? Does it pour? That kind of thing. But, so Richard Lee, who was this interesting ceramicist, was deliberately not talking about glazes. And this young artist, Aaron Angel, was excitingly talking about his glaze recipes, and it was a kind of strange sort of turning point in a way that we needn't be ashamed of. You know, the technical stuff to do with ceramics is quite challenging. There's no doubt about it, I think. I mean, Gordon, in a way, kept things simple, but in a way he didn't. He fired these pieces over and over. And he could really make anything. He was such a good thrower. He threw for television. You saw his hands between programs. This was during the 50s. You know, you had those bits of interfilm between programs. And one of them was a field of waving corn, and the other was Gordon's hands throwing a pot.
Are there any more remarks or questions?
I wanted to thank you for that poetic lecture, because I'm a potter myself and I study sculpture here in Hamburg. And the way you presented this work of Gordon Baldwin was really touching me, because I think I can share many of those tensions or questions you ask yourself when you are between those two poles, or maybe there aren't those two poles, but they are constructed in a way, and you try to find your way through it. And I think I never heard anyone like speak about ceramic in this way, like to say that what I would share, like that you, when you work with clay, then you create landscapes, or you work with geographies and you work them into the material, or you work around all those mysteriousnesses and darknesses also in yourself, or you work it through this hollowness. And it's all those words are very accurate, I find, for the material and for the forms. And just thank you for that. It touched me a lot.
It's really thanks to Gordon. He sort of isolated that essence in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose other kind of radical potters have done it, but he's particularly this the tension, the space inside, the space you don't see.
Totally. And also when, I mean, I can only guess what he used when I don't read it, but to see that he works a lot with those oxides and not so much with glossy surfaces and like decorative ways of using the tools you can use as a potter, but to use the raw oxides and the raw engobe, and to have this huge variety in surfaces. It's really it has a huge poetic visual language to me, and that's what I find so inspiring, because I always hated glazes myself. I feel like you produce something and then you cover it and you can't see the actual thing anymore. Yeah, but it's still glossy. So now we start talking glazes as well. I think like I don't particularly agree with all the forms he made or I have for now seen, but like the techniques or the this poetry in the form and in the surfaces is really something that I feel inspired by.
Yeah, no, he is inspiring, really, and the sort of matte surfaces are. I mean, he did go through this earlier dark, glossy stage. I could have shown many more of those, but in the end, it's this kind of a braided, matte surface that. Well, it's a bit like hakame, isn't it? Korean pottery with a white slip. There are links. I mean, everything. I suppose I want to make the point that we can't just take him for sculpture and fine art. There is a ceramic sensibility that one shouldn't overlook.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Did he want to be, do you think that he wanted to be taken seriously as a sculptor?
I think he very much did. He knew he should be showing with sculptors, but he never was. I mean, it was never granted to him. Supposing he'd managed to live another 10 years, it's a bit like Gillian Lowndes, who, again, was never seen in that context. And sadly, she's dead, but now she is being seen in that context. So, I don't know. I'm very interested in the history of taste and how artists drop from view or are rediscovered. But it's very odd to have seen it happen in your lifetime. That something that, when I started writing my book, The Crafts in Britain in the 20th Century, just the word craft was a no-no, and people would look rather shocked and depressed. But now the word's been kind of rehabilitated. So it's.
But I'm wondering, because when I saw the slide you showed of Man Ray's sewing machine with the thing over it really made me remember this feeling when someone who isn't a fine artist teaches you art and is a teacher, and they don't talk about the sewing machine being covered up, but I'm sure I don't know the work from Man Ray, but I can imagine what the concept behind the work is, and instead having an art teacher being look at the shape of it. Yes. And that allowed the work to become between the fact that it didn't have to be fine art sculpture allowed it to become what you were talking about, which is now we understand now that fine art can be emotional and visual, but that also wasn't do you know what?
Yes.
This emotionality of the work was also, it wasn't just craft that wasn't allowed, it was this sensibility. Yes. Was also kind of reduced, and those moments with your teacher where you created emotion together, they were kind of the magic moments at art school, at least for me. I don't know.
Yes, I see. Yes, sort of. Yeah. I think it's interesting that Gordon. He didn't really go out and about looking at contemporary art at all. And he didn't travel. He travelled in his mind and through books and through music a lot. But he was in a world he constructed, that was very specific.
I have a question about these musical travels that you mentioned. Excuse me. Thank you for the talk. I have a little question about these musical travels, because in the beginning you mentioned the music playing, and you played music, and you mentioned John Cage. And I was wondering, I mean, in this very long period of his work, were there any contacts to the Black Mountain College also, and to North Carolina? Because you said you traveled in his mind, but the work so obviously could have been there at the same time.
No, sadly not. I'm not sure he ever went to the States. So, you know, he felt really close to, I think he liked Philip Glass too, and John Cage, but it was all listened to in his studio. Yeah. No, it's.
You mustn't be there for being close to the people. Yeah, nowadays, no? No, but not nowadays. I can imagine. You can be very close to something very far.
I suppose it's a kind of. It's inspiring to think, you know, that it's a bit like that French novel Journey Around My Room, that you perhaps don't have to travel if you if you can look at the books and listen to the music, and maybe it's just a particular very English story, I don't know. No. Yes, it's. Well, he just. It sounded rather banal. He knew what he liked, and he sought it out. But it didn't seem to involve going places.
I had a question about the one of the drawings that you showed, Darkness, I think it was called. I wasn't sure whether it was just darkness or whether darkness with an exclamation mark at the end of it. But I mean, a lot of the ceramic work is quite existential, and I was wondering what change you saw in the work after sort of with his encroaching blindness, and perhaps what that meant with his own mortality as well, and what sort of change we saw in Gordon's work as that blindness sort of took hold. And
there are some late pieces in the show, and they're much simpler sort of vessel-y forms. Like he was finding it hard to sort of do the work he'd been doing before, and those drawings are all made when he was going blind. So I mean, they're a positive thing coming out of the blindness, but they're sort of tragic at the same time. Yeah, darkness there's an exclamation mark, isn't there? Darkness. I mean, it's interesting that he could draw, or wanted to draw, but making pieces in the kind of rather strange, intuitive way, he'd create a shape and then go on altering it and so on. That seemed to be impossible as he got blinder.
Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious sort of graphic quality to the works as well. I mean, but as you said as well, you know, as a material, sort of tactile, and you know, there's a sensuality to the materiality of clay. But I was just, I wondered whether existentially whether his sort of mindset started to change, or whether whether you saw that in the work as well in the later years. But
yes, I felt the work, I'd say it dropped off, but it became just a lot simpler. Yeah. No, there's a strange essay by, is it by someone called John Perrault, called Fear of Clay. again written at this moment when clay was not thought to be a suitable material in itself, especially if it was fired and glazed or slipped or anything like that. It kind of was outside the fold. The clay was too uncontrollable. But of course Gordon did control it. But,
Fear of clay.
yes, it was in Art Forum, I think, but there were plenty of bits of writing about the wrong path that Picasso had taken by making work like that in fired clay.
All right. Thank you so much. Unless there's one last really urgent comment or question, I think we would wrap it here. Tanya, thanks from the bottom of my heart for making it all the way over here and to give us this lecture. If you want to learn more about Gordon's work, we have the catalog downstairs. Come back, visit us another time. We're doing a program that I hope is as good as this was tonight, relatively regularly. And you're always welcome back here at the Kunstverein. Thank you.
Thank you.